question and answers will not be recorded. Right, so I'm going to start with, this is the Mountgorry Large Residential Development, the LRD. That's what it stands for. Not particularly any sophisticated phrase, it's just large residential development. That reference number is the most important thing you need to know regards the site, because if you're going to put in a submission or an observation on the site, the reference number is the only document that you need in order to do that. So it's, in my opinion, the most important aspect of it. And this is presented and created by me. So if there's bias in it, it's bias that I created. So okay, it's just doing an animation, which I'll do in a second. Okay, so I'm going to go through the purpose of the present is to look at the planning file, investigate planning concerns of the proposal. I'm going to give an overview, which is 123 residential units, 55 one beds, 68 two beds. And then some of the key concerns that I got from a planning context, they might not line up with your concerns, but that actually would meet with proper planning, would be lack of green open space, height, massing, park and transportation concerns, community infrastructure, social integration, sustainability, climate action, shortcomings. So they're the key areas of concern that I would have in relation to the development. And I want to put up a helpful warning. A lot of this is not my opinion, in that I'm going to give you the facts based on planning legislation. And that is the law that we're governed by. And we can all have an opinion on something, but unless we have a planning context into our opinion or rationale to it, it won't bear fruit in terms of a planning objection or observation that someone might put forward. So legal documents relevant to this planning application, of which there are many. When people talk about planning, particularly from Fingal County Council, everyone talks about the Fingal Development Plan as if it's the overarching document that binds us in a planning context. It's not. There's more than 15 legal documents mentioned in this application alone. So I will go through them in a very minute detail. So National Planning Framework, Regional Spatial Economic Strategy, Transport Strategy for Greater Dublin Area, 22 to 42, the Section 28 guideline, Ministerial Guidelines, Planning and Development Act 2000, amended in 21, and another bill just last week that is actually the 23 bill that was only passed in 2024. Apartment Height Guidelines 2018, amended in 2023. Design Manual for Urban Roads, Sustainable Residential Developments of Urban Areas. All of these, okay? There's a lot of them. There's not just one. There's a huge amount of planning files, and the planners know it. We need to know it because we need to reference them in our application. So a legal and legislative basis for policy. So I think our development plan. This is part of the Planning and Development Act 2000, which has been amended, and this is to ensure that the zoned land in each area is serviced for future housing. So we as councillors zone the land in the local area across all of Fingal, and we say this is what it can be used for. And for instance, this is zoned residential, so that means it can be used for residential purposes. If it was zoned for community infrastructure, you could have maybe a nursing home, or you could have shopping facilities. It depends on the land use zoning. But because of its proximity and because of the planning permission that was active when the plan was being developed, we weren't able to dezone it or change it because there was an active planning application at the time. So that's what that is for. National Planning Framework. This is one of the key documents, and this is like a future-looking document. It's about how areas grow. It's a guide on growth and development. So it talks about compact growth, especially in Dublin, big emphasis on apartments and densities. And this document that you see at the bottom is actually under consultation at the moment. So if you want to have an opinion and tell them you're completely bonkers, parts of Dublin that just can't handle what it currently has, might be a good point to tell them that every part of Dublin isn't a key metropolitan town that can handle excessive densities that we think we have. But the big strategy is to use brownfield sites along transport corridors. In theory, Mountgorry is a transport site on a brownfield site on a transport corridor, but it doesn't have Metro, Dart, or any of those public transport links, even though it is on the main corridor. So what we're looking at, the key objectives in this one are building a home within existing settlement, favour development of boost population and jobs in urban areas, prioritise development on service and serviceable lands. So they want the infrastructure to be in place, essentially, is what they're saying here. So this is a bit more about the regional spatial economic strategy, which uses the national planning framework, but on a regional basis. So this is the Leinster, kind of Dublin Midlands, Eastern region, regional spatial economic strategy. I know this is a lot. I want to give you a background so that when I get into it, you'll understand where I'm coming from. And the role of the RSES is to implement the previous one we talked about, which is the national planning framework, and it's aligned with population, jobs, growth, transport, and infrastructure for strategic development areas. Swords is considered a key town in the settlement, provides sustainable, compact, sequential growth and urban regeneration. See it there. So Swords is considered a key town, which means they want the growth to happen massively because of the infrastructure proposals for the area. So there's a real focus on regeneration and development of Swords. And that's why if you've seen the large housing leaflet you dropped into the doors, you would notice all the different housing projects going in Swords. So the developer proposes under here to support considerable re-intensification of the infill brownfield site to provide high dense, people intensive use with an existing build-up area of Dublin. So the top is what they want. They want Dublin to grow by 1.4 million people and the suburbs by 1.65 million by 2031. So that's the population growth that they're expecting. And this is how the developer says we're going to do it. Okay?
Say that the total population for Dublin eventually would be 2.69 million.
Yeah, I'll get into that at the end. Yeah, there's a lot. So the transport strategy for Greater Dublin area, in relevant to this document, is Metrolink, Swords, and Dublin Airport, dark expansion, electrification of rail line, Lewis to Finglas, bus connects, cycle network, park and ride. They're the ones that are relevant that would be mentioned. Department of Housing, Section 28 guidelines. This is all the design standards for new apartments, urban building height guidelines. Additional information. So this basis uses CSO data and other data, and the minister can essentially amend legislation through Section 28 guidelines to allow them or their department to do essentially what they want. So they say there's a focus on improving connectivity and infrastructure, but I beg to differ. So I'm going to go to apartment height guidelines, and I highlighted this one. This is under category 2 of apartment height guidelines. It's between 4 and 6 stories. So major towns as identified and promoted for strategic development of the national planning framework. Because this is a major town, it falls into 4 to 6 stories. That's essentially just what it is. There's a lot of information there, but I just want you to know, because it's a major town, the guideline is 4 to 6 stories at a minimum for all development. Never mind apartments. Just so you know, this is so it's a metro zoning area pertaining to the site, which seeks to provide high density mixed use development. The separation distance between the site and adjoining land uses, I do not consider this is the developer speaking, abrupt transition in scale. So he's saying it wouldn't really visually impact anyone, and he thinks it's acceptable. And then he talks about planning history and the fact that it was accepted in the past. So that's what the developer is using to justify under these guidelines. These are the main policies. These supersede everything. These were brought in 2018 when the Fine Gael government met an American consortium to fast track planning, and these are called SPPR, specific planning policy requirements. And these 4 policies can bypass any planning legislation, and they supersede everything else. They are separation distances, which have changed from being mandatory to 26 meters to 22 meters to now 16 meters by law. So you could have by law, you could have a 2-story house 16 meters from a 4 to 6 story apartment block, and that's legally sound, because that's SPPR 1. This is the law. This isn't me telling you I'm in favour. Absolutely am. Minimum private open space standards. They are usually enforced by the Fine Gael development plan, but if an SPPR says differently, then they're not. It's 15 square meters per unit. Car parking standards. It's a really fun topic on this particular site. And then cycling and parking storage, which is actually, there's no ambiguity there. People are happy enough with usually cycling storage. So the key issues, from my perspective in this development with SPPR 2 and 3, which is minimum private open space. I know you will say separation distances, and I'd agree with you in terms of the visual impact. We'll get to that. It won't wash in terms of planning legislation. It's a nuisance. It looks horrible, and in my opinion, it is wrong. But it's not legally binding. It's not an illegal issue. It's absolutely sound planning. And SPPR 2 and 3, I would argue, aren't. I would argue they're very good planning policies to argue that they're breaking in this regard. So this is what they actually, so that's the minimum requirements: 20 square meters for one bed, 30 square meters for two, 40 square meters for, so it's quite actually a small amount of area that they have to do because there's only 1 and 2 beds in this site, but I'll show you how they're breaking it. Right. Now to the fun stuff, the actual proposal. Mountgorry, large scale development, 123 apartments, 55 one beds, 68 2 beds, 4 to 5 stories, less than 1 hectare. So that's, and then there's 24 car parking spaces for the 123 apartments, which is obviously a massive bone of contention, and a limited mention of green space and pedestrian paths. Yeah, so this is actually the breakdown they give on their website. So it's 404 cycling spots, 274 of them are long term, 130 are short term. Don't get the rationale between short and long term cycling. I don't know how that looks, but it's interesting. 24 car parking spots, 6 of them are EV, 2 are disabled, and 6 car club spots. Don't know how you define a car club spot either, but it's a car sharing, carpooling scheme. And then, so it's the developmental area is 1.18. So
they're going to give free bikes for all the apartments.
I know. And then the open spaces, internal open spaces, only 79 square meters. You've seen in the previous, it needs to be a hell of a lot more. So we'll talk about that. And then they talk about a massive amount of public open space because of the park adjoining it, which we'll get into. So my key concerns, based on the legislation, not based on my opinion, are lack of green open space density, height and massing, parking, transportation, insufficient community infrastructure, and sustainability and climate action gaps. Okay, let's get into the lack of green open space. So insufficient provision of functional green open space. What I mean by functional green open space, we now have a thing called sustainable urban drainage. So if you see new estates, they'll have green open space that has like a bevel in the ground. And it's like a mini swimming pool. That's for drainage, so that every area now has its own internal drainage that doesn't have to connect to a felt sewer outside. It's called sustainable urban drainage. It works really well, but it can't be considered open space because in theory, you're not meant to be able to play on the felt sewer. But kids can play on it at certain times of the year when it's dry. But the point is, if there's an overflow on it, it is a drainage overflow site, and it can't be by law considered public open space. I'll get to the questions at the end, just because I'm recording it, and So the potential negative impact on the community well-being and biodiversity, and this is inconsistent with Bengal Development Plan, Chapter 9, and I'll get into the specific parts. So this is what I'm talking about here. This is the green open space. So here's the courtyard, which is, if you look at the whole scale of the development, that's the open space in the courtyard. It's minuscule and doesn't meet the criteria. But what they're trying to use is the communal open space that's adjacent to their site as a justification of the open space. This little courtyard here and these trees here, that's not open space. That is not effective or sufficient open space. And in my opinion, under Section 5.3.3 of the Sustainable Residential Development Guidelines, the vague provision of open space in the proposal suggests to me that they're not it won't serve as a meaningful recreational space, and that would be my argument. And I also say it's not functional open space. So I would say, and I found that in the planning report and statement of consistency, sustainable urban drainage. This is a big one. They talk about the site here, the top right hand corner. But what I will say is that failure to have effective sustainable urban drainage is completely illegal on all new developments. And they were essential to mitigate flooding and promote urban biodiversity. So I would say under section 9.4.1 of the Fingal Development Plan, the Mountgorry proposal does not sufficiently integrate SuDS, which are meant to be critical part of green infrastructure. That's an absolute fact. And that's page 36 and 37 of their own report on planning and consistency. And then height and massing. Okay, so there's an abrupt transition from 4 to 5 stories. Abrupt transitions happen when you have such large scale development in such a small site. In a normal site, you would have scaling from you should have scaling from 2 to 3, 4 or 5 going back. But because this is overlooking a main road, they would say we can have this abrupt. But actually, it's bad planning just to have abrupt building near low-rise housing, even though the separation distances we'll get to in a minute aren't really an issue. But there was potential, as the lady said earlier, for overshadowing and disruption of areas' visual harmony, and does not follow gradual guidelines and heights for transitions. It doesn't follow them, it's against them. That's chapter 14 of the Fingal Development Plan and Urban Development and Building Height Guidelines. For context, that's what I'm pointing at. So massing, okay? And essentially what I discussed earlier, this is what the developer is saying. The landscape and visual impact assessment here, daylight and sunlight assessment submitted demonstrating no significant, didn't say no impact, they said no significant impact will occur as a result of the proposed development. And it uses the policies that I told you earlier that I would refer to throughout the whole thing, national planning framework, design standards, all the stuff that I to argue against them, they're using it to argue in favour. Of course they do that. And they want to strike a balance between the surrounding environments and the nearby residential developments, which they don't, in my opinion. And they mention here the right at the top, which is considered to be an appropriate transitional height from 2 to story dwellings at female housing estate, from number apartment 3 story apartments, St. Rivers Estate, and previously permitted the last scene were 5 and 6 stories. Talks about the development of some as well. I give specific reference to house number 30 in the planning application. I didn't mention it in the presentation with those. There's an inadequate transition in building heights, as I said earlier, and that's the subsection that it's contained in, and that's the areas that I'm emphasising in terms of key considerations. I will go through them at the end. And then this is a big one. It's a big one in favour of the developer, because even though the heights are wrong and the way it gets bigger is wrong, the density is actually fair in terms of the strategy, because they're using 1 and 2 beds, because they want to sell more. So, but they could actually increase the number of occupants by making more 3 beds. They'd make less money because 3 beds take up more space. But the reality of the situation is, under this framework plan, they should be increasing the amount of people living on a site if they're going to have that many apartments. But they're not doing that because they're not having 3 beds. So I just want you to understand that underutilization of the site will be an argument that they will consider against us in this, because under the national planning framework and the regional spatial economic strategy, that site could get more people in there, but it would require a few 3-bed units to be added in. You're talking about 30 more people in total based on the size, based on the plans. Don't agree with them in any way, shape, or form. I think it's totally unreasonable, the densities, but those are the rules. And I don't just give you all the issues that I have. I want to give you something that they don't highlight in their plan that they probably should. They missed the step by not acknowledging that they could increase the density. You know, they should have stated that as a planning thing. We could make this larger, which they did in the previous development. Separations distances. This is what we were talking about last time. So from house number 30 in Seamount View here, you're talking 49.7 meters, and you say that's quite a lot. But when you actually see, because the site is raised at a height, it's actually a much greater visual impact. It's more like 8 or 9 story impact than a 5-story impact because of the raised site that it is on the road. Because the road gradually, if you go up the road, it gradually increases up at Applegreen, and that's kind of a peak, and then it goes down a little bit towards the pavilions, and Seamount is actually below it. So, so you will notice that at the end, and then the other apartments, St. Rivers, they're quite a bit away on the opposite side of the road. And then it's the boundary up to the corner here of 19 is only 23.42 meters of the green space here, just the green space here, just to the green space, not the boundary wall. Only 24 parking spaces per 123 units, which is insufficient for this context. Limited access to public transport, increasing car dependency, risk of traffic congestion and parking issues. I said, that's me. And these are the areas I will argue from a planning requirement. It outlines minimum parking requirements for suburban areas where car dependency is higher due to limited public transport. The proposed ratio of parking spaces to resident use is insufficient, in my opinion, leading to traffic congestion. They talk about public transport accessibility massively in this application, as if we are in the city centre with buses coming every 2 minutes. And wait till you see the photo they use and the site they use. So while the development encourages walking and cycling, it does not sufficiently account for the existing reliance on cars in the area. Okay, so this is where I talk about SQPR3. They talk about it too. They say maximum ratio. So the maximum ratio they're allowed under this guideline is 8.5 parking spaces per dwelling. But they've decided to go far less because they should be encouraged to substantially reduce or wholly eliminate, while in areas of medium accessibility, car parking provision should be substantially reduced. So they're saying here, minimize, substantially reduce or wholly eliminate applications that have good access to urban services and public transport. And that's their emphasis. So they're like, we are 100% behind this. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, you're way up here. Like, if you're waiting for Metro North to come in order to reach that target, I'm afraid you're 40 years later and we're still waiting. So yes, this is a developmental site. And they talk, I thought it was hilarious, they talk about the 2 bus stops here, serviced by the 102 every once an hour if you're lucky, and then half of them are ghost buses which don't turn up. And all of a sudden, because the 102 is a bus that everyone loves down from Sutton to Dublin Airport, that all of a sudden you can have 24 car park. Can you imagine a single story bus half the time trying to facilitate that amount of capacity? And then I talk about like the absence of speed ramps, traffic calming measures adjoining the regional road, coupled with narrow or no footpaths. And then when they are present, they are either predominantly not level or wide enough to facilitate a buggy, wheelchair, not to mention hundreds of residents at peak times. So like, I actually think it's actually a bit of a disgrace, the fact that they can try and justify car parking standards for this road, because they only have an obligation to do a footpath outside their estate. If you try and walk down Mountgorry, I was walk from Seamount to the houses across the road just to knock on the door and give them the information, and it's an absolute death trap. There's no paths, and the people living there like everyone knows that. So whilst inside the estate is fine walking, that Mountgorry road is not fit for purpose. And if someone needs to get to the pavilions, especially if hundreds of people need to access that corridor, it's not safe, it's not accessible, and no single pedestrian crossing or footpath will make that safe. So on one hand, they're arguing the main road is a feature, but in my opinion, it's actually a further concern, adding to how unsafe it is. So they will say the regional spatial economic strategy requires 0.5 car parking spaces for 1 to 2 bedroom units. They're even less than 0.5 per unit. This is a false measure and not an accurate depiction, as the services do not exist in apartments before the metro is delivered. They keep hammering on about the R132 upgrade and bus connects in the site, and it drives me scatty because they say here, look, Ballion's within 800 metres of bus connect, 1,600 metres of planned Lewis Dark metro rail station, covered under Section 9 of the land zone. That's all correct. But we cannot get to a framework now where we're zoning and building developments at scale and putting people in isolated situations with no facilities whatsoever and saying public transport be here in about 10, 15 years' time. Enjoy, like, it doesn't make sense. It's so unfair. Lack of community facilities, so there's no provision for community service, for childcare services on the site. Zero. Large developments require integrate community infrastructure. It says there's a creche across the way in Waterside, part of the development, and then fails to meet the requirements for any development over 75 units. By law, has to have a creche. Most of them don't. It's still the law. They bypass this law all the time. And if they do have them, someone doesn't usually buy the creche and they end up selling it as a house 5 years after planning. This happens all the time. That's chapter 4 of the Fingal Development Plan, housing planning guidelines. Okay, so one glaring omission, as I said, is the community infrastructure, such as childcare facilities. And I mentioned it there, 4.34 of the Fingal Development Plan, mandate 75 units. Lack of detailed community open space. So amends the public open space, but it's not clearly defined how it will serve the community needs or social interactions or encourage interaction. You can't use open space for your site that's not actually on your site. You can say it will complement your site, but you can't use it to justify your site. Okay, so no comprehensive sustainability strategy, limited mention of PV panels, lack of integrated sustainable urban drainage, as I mentioned earlier. So the only mention of in one of the documents was on page 153 regards solar panels, right? And it says, along with the western boundary, it says green roofs lifts PV panels like ESB substation. Okay, one sentence, 153 pages. No indication of use, type, or form. I've never seen a planning application that wants to use sustainable infrastructure like solar panels and not mention how it will benefit the site, how the batteries will be stored, how many panels will be on each site. That is, last time I seen it was on the Glen Bay development in Rosestown. Do you know what they're doing? Once the contracts were issued, they removed it. They were planned and they said PV panels will be with it. It wasn't a requirement of the planning. And they remove it. That is, to me, is a glaring example of them going to build an A-rated insulated home without any sustainable PV panels or anything like that. I think that's glaringly obvious by their lack of desire to discuss it. So, conclusion: the proposal in its current form, in my opinion, does not align with key local and national planning guidelines. There's significant revisions that need to be addressed: green space, parking, height and massing. And the proposal should better serve the needs of the local community and contribute to sustainable growth, which it doesn't. I'm going to get to the lovely folks at the end. The deadline for submissions is the Wednesday the 30th at 5 o'clock. The key points is the LRD 0025/S3E. If you can put that up on the website. So follow my guide on the website or sign up to my newsletter. Or if you want my key points document, rather than print it off, it was a 5-page key points document. Just email me and I will send it directly on to you. My email is there, dean.mulligan@cllrs.fingal.ie. I'll give it to you all at the end. And then I'm going to just end this now recording.